They called her too fat and too poor right to her face. The entire store laughed. But when her husband walked in 24 hours later, their laughter died in their throats. The automatic doors of Prestige Diamonds whispered open, releasing a wave of cool, perfumed air that carried the scent of leather and expensive cologne. Margaret Chen stepped inside, her worn sneakers squeaking softly against the polished marble floor. At 52, she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite her simple gray sweater that had seen too many washes, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the gentle curve of her belly that spoke of years of putting everyone else's needs before her own. But here's what nobody in that glittering showroom knew. Margaret Chen's husband, David Chen, had built a tech empire worth $800 million. And Margaret? She preferred thrift stores to designer boutiques, homemade meals to five-star restaurants, and genuine conversations to networking events. The contrast hit her immediately. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across walls lined with diamonds that cost more than most people's homes. Salespeople in tailored suits glided between glass cases like sharks in an aquarium, their movements precise, predatory, calculated. Margaret approached the nearest display case, her heart beating faster. Inside, engagement rings sparkled under halogen lights, each one a small constellation of promise and hope. She pressed her face closer to the glass, her breath fogging the surface slightly as she searched for something special. 27 years ago, David had proposed with a simple gold band from a pawn shop. They'd been broke college students then, surviving on ramen noodles and dreams. Now, with their daughter Emma getting engaged next month, Margaret wanted to find her something beautiful. Something that said, "I believe in love," without screaming, "Look how much money we have." "Excuse me," Margaret said softly to a young salesperson with perfectly styled blonde hair and a nameplate reading, "Vanessa Grant. Could I look at some engagement rings, please?" Vanessa's eyes swept over Margaret like a scanner, taking inventory. The faded sweater, the department store jeans, the absence of designer accessories. Her smile never faltered, but something cold flickered behind her green eyes. "Of course," Vanessa said, her voice sweet as artificial honey, "we have some lovely starter pieces over here." She gestured toward a corner display case filled with the store's most modest offerings. "These range from about $500 to $2,500. Margaret followed, feeling the weight of other customers' stares. A woman in a fur coat whispered something to her companion, both of them glancing in Margaret's direction before dissolving into muffled laughter. But Margaret had endured worse. Growing up as the daughter of immigrants who cleaned office buildings at night, she'd learned early that people's cruelty often revealed more about them than their targets. She'd also learned that kindness was a choice, not a luxury. "Actually," Margaret said gently, "I was hoping to see something a bit more substantial for my daughter's engagement." Vanessa's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh, well." She paused, clearly calculating whether this frumpy woman could afford anything worthwhile. "What's your budget?" "I'm not sure yet. I'd like to see what speaks to me first." The request seemed to physically pain Vanessa. She glanced toward her colleague, Anthony Patel, who was helping a well-dressed couple select a tennis bracelet. Anthony caught her look and smirked, shaking his head slightly. "Ma'am," Vanessa said, her patience clearly thinning, "I'm trying to save us both some embarrassment here. These rings are actually quite popular with budget-conscious shoppers." Heat crept up Margaret's neck, but she maintained her composure. "I understand, but could I please see some of the pieces in the main display, just to get a sense of what's available?" Now, other customers were openly staring. The woman in the fur coat had moved closer, clearly enjoying the unfolding drama. A man in an expensive suit checked his Rolex and sighed loudly, as if Margaret's presence was personally inconveniencing him. Vanessa's mask finally slipped. "Look, I'm trying to save us both some embarrassment here. Those rings start at $15,000. I can tell just by looking that you're not in that market." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but something else burned brighter.
the memory of David's voice that morning. "Get her something beautiful, sweetheart. Don't worry about the cost. Emma deserves something as special as she is." "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Margaret said quietly. "I can afford—" "Honey," Anthony Patel had drifted over, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We're not trying to be mean, but these aren't costume jewelry prices. We're talking serious money here." "I understand that," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. By now, the entire store had fallen silent except for the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. Even the security guard had turned to watch, his hand resting casually on his radio. Vanessa exchanged another look with Anthony, then addressed Margaret with the kind of voice one might use with a confused child. "Ma'am, that ring you were looking at? It's $35,000. The setting alone costs more than most people's cars." Laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Not loud, but audible enough. The kind of laughter that cuts deeper than shouting. Margaret's vision blurred slightly. Not from tears, though they threatened. From the familiar sensation of being made small, of being judged by the surface while the depth remained hidden. She thought of Emma, her brilliant daughter who'd graduated summa cum laude, who volunteered at homeless shelters, who'd found love with a kind man who didn't care that she drove a 15-year-old Honda. "Perhaps I should speak to your manager," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, I am the manager," Vanessa replied, her chest puffing with authority, "and I think we've wasted enough of everyone's time here." The crowd was growing. Phone cameras appeared, drawn by the scent of viral content. A teenage employee emerged from the back room, alerted by the commotion. Margaret looked around the circle of faces, some amused, some uncomfortable, all watching her humiliation like it was entertainment. She thought of David, probably in a board meeting at that very moment, making decisions that affected thousands of employees. She thought of their modest home, chosen not because they couldn't afford bigger, but because they believed in living below their means. She thought of her parents who taught her that a person's worth wasn't measured in dollars, but in dignity. "I see," Margaret said finally. She reached into her simple canvas purse, past the grocery coupons and Emma's childhood photos she still carried, and pulled out a business card. Not hers, she didn't have business cards, but David's, the one he'd given her that morning with a kiss and the words, "Just in case you need to convince them you're serious." She placed the card gently on the glass counter. "Could you please call this number and ask for David Chen? Tell him his wife is here." Vanessa barely glanced at the card. "Ma'am, I'm not calling anyone. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The security guard stepped forward, his presence suddenly looming. Margaret felt the walls closing in, the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every moment of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. But then something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the crowd spoke up. "Wait a minute." An elderly gentleman pushed through the circle of onlookers. He was impeccably dressed, but walked with a slight limp, his cane tapping softly against the marble floor. His nameplate read, "Harrison Brooks, store owner." "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of decades in business. Vanessa straightened, suddenly nervous. "Mr. Brooks, this woman is trying to waste our time looking at rings she obviously can't afford. I was just explaining our policies." Harrison's eyes moved from Vanessa to Margaret, taking in her simple clothes, her dignified posture, and the business card still lying on the counter. He picked up the card, read it, and his eyebrows rose significantly. David Chen, of Chen Technologies. The name seemed to ripple through the crowd like electricity. Chen Technologies was a household name, their software running on millions of devices worldwide. "Ma'am," Harrison said to Margaret, his tone completely different from his employees, "I apologize for any confusion. Would you please allow me to assist you personally?" But Margaret was already shaking her head, backing toward the door. The damage was done. The humiliation complete. The circle of phones still recording, capturing her shame for posterity. "No, thank you," she said softly. "I think I've seen enough." She walked toward the exit, her sneakers squeaking against the marble with each step. Behind her, she could hear Harrison's sharp voice beginning to address his staff, but the words faded as the automatic doors closed behind her. Outside, the afternoon sun felt harsh against her face. Margaret stood on the sidewalk for a moment, trying to steady her breathing, trying to process what had just happened. A couple walked past, the woman glancing at her with the kind of expression reserved for people who'd witnessed something embarrassing. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed David's number. "Hey, sweetheart." His warm voice filled her ear immediately. "How's the ring shopping going?" She started, then stopped. How could she explain? How could she tell this man who'd conquered boardrooms and built empires that his wife had been humiliated by teenagers in expensive suits? "Margaret, are you okay?" "I'm fine," she lied.
"Margaret, are you okay?" "I'm fine," she lied. I think I need to look somewhere else." There was a pause. David knew her well enough to hear what she wasn't saying. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice shifting to something harder, more protective. "Prestige Diamonds on 5th Street. But David, don't. I'll be right there." "No, please, I just want to go home." Another pause. Then softer. "Okay, but Margaret, we're going to fix this." She didn't ask what he meant. After 27 years of marriage, she recognized that tone. It was the same voice he'd used when Emma was being bullied in middle school. The same quiet intensity that had once convinced a room full of investors to fund his first startup. That evening, Margaret sat in their modest kitchen, absently stroking their aging golden retriever, when David paced the length of their hardwood floors. He'd been making phone calls for hours, his voice a low murmur behind his office door. "You don't have to do anything," Margaret said when he finally emerged. "It's just people, being people." David knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. His wedding ring, still the simple gold band from their college days, caught the kitchen light. "Maggie," he said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. 27 years ago, I promised to love and protect you. That promise didn't come with fine print." The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of Seattle weather that made the city feel wrapped in flannel. Margaret was in her garden, tending to the tomatoes she grew for the local food bank, when David appeared in the doorway. "Want to come for a drive?" She looked up from the soil on her hands, studied his face. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal gray one, reserved for congressional hearings and major acquisitions. "Where are we going?" "Trust me." 20 minutes later, they pulled up outside Prestige Diamonds. Margaret's stomach dropped. "David, no, let's just go home." But he was already out of the car, walking around to open her door. "Come on, time to finish what we started." The same automatic doors whispered open, the same perfumed air, the same crystal chandeliers, the same marble floors. But everything felt different now. Harrison Brooks was waiting just inside the entrance, along with Vanessa and Anthony, both looking distinctly uncomfortable. A small crowd of other employees hovered nearby, clearly aware that something significant was about to happen. "Mr. Chen," Harrison said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming in." David ignored the outstretched hand. His eyes swept the store, taking in every detail, every face. When his gaze landed on Vanessa, she actually took a step backward. "I understand," David said, his voice carrying clearly through the showroom, "that my wife was treated poorly here yesterday." "There was a misunderstanding," Harrison began, but David raised a hand. "I'm not talking to you yet." David turned to face Vanessa directly. "I'm talking to the woman who decided that my wife wasn't worth common courtesy." Vanessa's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the color draining from her face. "Sir, I was just following protocol. We have to be careful about what? About treating human beings with respect?"
The store had fallen completely silent, except for the soft jazz, which now seemed obscenely cheerful, given the tension crackling through the air. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With deliberate movements, he opened his checking account app and turned the screen toward the assembled crowd. The number displayed made several people gasp audibly. "This," David said, "is my checking account balance. Just the checking account. Would you like to see the investment portfolio, the real estate holdings, the trust funds we've set up for underprivileged students?" Vanessa looked like she might be sick. "But here's what's really important," David continued, his voice dropping to something more dangerous. "None of that money, not $1, gives me the right to treat another person badly, and it sure as hell doesn't give you the right to humiliate my wife." He moved closer to Vanessa, not threateningly, but with the kind of presence that filled rooms during hostile takeovers. "Do you know what my wife was doing before she came here yesterday? She was volunteering at the women's shelter, helping abuse survivors learn computer skills so they can find work. Do you know what she did after you humiliated her? She came home and made dinner for the college student who lives in our garage apartment rent-free while he finishes his degree." Anthony Patel had gone completely pale. Several customers had stopped pretending to shop and were openly staring. "My wife," David continued, "is worth more than every piece of jewelry in this store combined. Not because of my money, but because of who she is. Because she sees people's hearts instead of their bank accounts. Because she spent 27 years making the world a little kinder." Margaret felt tears threatening, but not from humiliation this time, from love, from gratitude, from the overwhelming feeling of truly being seen and defended. David turned to Harrison. "Now I'll talk to you. What are you going to do about this?" Harrison looked around his store, at his employees, at the customers who were clearly recording everything on their phones. His business instincts warred with his conscience, and for a moment the outcome hung in the balance. Then he looked at Margaret, really looked at Margaret, and seemed to see what David saw, not a dowdy woman in a thrift store sweater, but a person of substance, of dignity, of worth. "Vanessa Anthony," Harrison said quietly, "you're terminated, effective immediately." Vanessa's mouth fell open. "Mr. Brooks, you can't." "I can, and I am. This is not how we treat people. This is not who we are." He turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, I owe you a profound apology. There's no excuse for how you were treated." But David wasn't finished. An apology doesn't undo the humiliation. It doesn't erase the video footage that's probably already circulating online. It doesn't fix the damage. Harrison nodded slowly. "What would you suggest?" David looked at Margaret, then back to Harrison. "My wife came here to buy an engagement ring for our daughter. She still needs that ring. Of course, anything in the store, at cost, not retail price, cost, and I want the profit that would have come from that sale donated to the women's shelter where my wife volunteers." "Done. And I want your entire staff to complete sensitivity training, real training, not some corporate video they'll sleep through. I want them to learn that a person's worth isn't measured by their appearance or their bank account." "Absolutely." David paused, studying Harrison's face. "And I want to know that this will never happen to anyone else, rich or poor. Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect." "You have my word, Mr. Chen. This was inexcusable, and it will never happen again." Margaret stepped forward then, her voice soft but clear. "I just want my daughter to have something beautiful, something that represents love, not money." Harrison personally escorted them to the main display case, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked it. Together, Margaret and David selected a ring that was perfect, not because of its price tag, but because of the way it caught the light, the way it seemed to whisper promises of happily ever after. As they prepared to leave, Harrison approached them one more time. "Mrs. Chen," he said, I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've learned that the most valuable things can't be bought or sold. Thank you for reminding me of that. Outside, as they walked toward their car, Margaret slipped her hand into David's. "You didn't have to do all that," she said. "Yes, I did. Not just for you, for everyone who's ever been judged by their appearance, everyone who's ever been made to feel small by people who mistake cruelty for sophistication." That weekend, Emma came over for dinner, and Margaret presented her with the ring. As her daughter's eyes filled with tears of joy, Margaret realized that the ring's true value wasn't in its carats or clarity, but in the story it would carry forward. A story about standing up to injustice, about the power of quiet dignity, about love that shows up when it matters most. Later that evening, as Margaret was washing dishes, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Chen, this is Harrison Brooks. I wanted you to know that we've had 17 people apply for jobs since word got out about what happened. They all said they wanted to work somewhere that treats people with respect. Thank you for helping us become better." Margaret smiled, dried her hands, and went to find David. She had a story to share about how sometimes the most ordinary moments become extraordinary when we choose courage over comfort, love over judgment, and dignity over silence. And the woman in the gray sweater taught a lesson that money couldn't buy, that true wealth is measured not in what we possess, but in how we treat each other when no one is keeping score. And in a world that often mistakes cruel